All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all doing okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's like we're heading into the home stretch now, right? Mid-November. Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about intraspecific competition. So this is competition among individuals within a species. So intra is within. Next lecture, we're going to talk about interspecific competition. So competition between two species. We're not going to take it up any higher order than that, but we will talk about competition between two species. And I'll give you a heads up now that that lecture, it's the Lotka-Volterra model of interspecific competition. It is a mathematically heavy lecture again, so be a good one to attend. But we'll be doing some calculations and some mathematical sort of things again. So I just wanted to give you that heads up that next week on Monday, the lecture will be a bit more mathematical. I'll probably go to campus and deliver the lecture there so I can use the blackboard again. Okay. But today we're going to talk about intraspecific competition. Okay. So the idea of density dependence, right, that we've talked about, this is implicit in this idea of population regulation, right? Because when things are really dense and you're reaching carrying capacity, there's lots of competition. And so that's going to have an impact on the overall population size, right? So this density dependence, this idea is implicit in the idea about regulating population size. So that means that density dependent effects are going to influence the population in proportion to how big the population is. So in proportion to that population size, right? Because when population size is low, that is when the density is really low, there's like no interactions, right? Everybody's got everything. They're not even interacting with each other. But then once you get to those high population sizes, those higher densities, you start getting close to that carrying capacity, right? This means that there's going to be an increase in competition among individuals, right? There's limited resources now, and so you're going to have competition among individuals to gain access to those resources. So this is back to that idea again in the logistic growth model that we looked at, that there's that piece of the logistic model that is explicitly about this density dependent component, right? That's what distinguishes the logistic from the exponential. Okay, so remembering that density dependent part of the logistic population growth equation, that's what we're talking about here. Okay. All right. So talking more about, so that's sort of a context to set this. So now we're talking a little bit more narrowing in about this intraspecific competition idea. So when we say that there's population regulation happening, so when we're talking about this idea of population regulation, that means that there's some kind of a feedback system. So we've talked about feedbacks before. So it means that there's some kind of homeostatic feedback system that's going to function with density, right? So there's this feedback system that's functioning with density. So the feedback involves competition among individuals of the same species for those limited environmental resources, right? So competition results when that needed resource is in short supply relative to the number of individuals who need it, right? That's competition. So again, it's this idea that there's a feedback system that's relying upon that density part, right? So as long as resources are abundant, right, and there's enough to allow all individuals a sufficient amount for what they need for survival and reproduction, there's going to be no competition, right? Everything's fine. But when the resources are insufficient to adequately satisfy everybody in the population, that means that those resources are going to be allocated, like how those resources are going to be allocated is going to have an influence on the overall population, on the welfare of that population. So we have this feedback system, right? So again, when the resources are abundant and the density is small, everybody's going to get what they need to survive and reproduce. But then once you get to higher population densities approaching that carrying capacity, now those resources are insufficient to supply everybody, right? There's insufficient resources for everybody to survive and reproduce. So this means those resources, how they're allocated, is going to have a dramatic influence on the whole overall welfare of that population. Okay. So there's three types of competition that we're going to talk about. The first one is called Scramble Competition. The second one is called Exploitative. And then the third one is contest or interference competition. And so I have these sad faces and happy faces as sort of an indication of what the outcome of these types of competition could look like. So the first one is scramble competition. You see there's a bunch of unhappy faces here. So scramble competition, in this case, all the competing individuals get so little of the resources that in extreme cases, none survive. But the overall definition includes that everyone suffers. Okay, so in really extreme cases, everybody dies. But the idea here again being is that the competing individuals get so little of the resources that are there that nobody does well. Everyone is suffering. Okay, this tends to produce, this type of competition, scramble competition, tends to produce really sharp fluctuations in population size over time. These really wild fluctuations over time. And so it limits the average population density to a value that's lower than what the resources could support if just some individuals were getting what they need, right? So it's this, basically in this scenario, no one is getting what they need. Okay, no one obtains the amount of resources that they need. And again, in an extreme case, none of them survive. And this is what drives those wild population fluctuations. So the finite resource that is shared equally among the competitors so that the quantity of food per individual declines with increasing density. As it gets more and more dense, nobody gets what they need. Okay, so again, everybody suffers. All the competing individuals, as population density gets higher, and those finite resources are there, nobody gets what they need, okay, when the population gets too dense. So the whole thing crashes. So everybody suffers, okay? And something that's important about this definition is that individuals are not directly competing with each other. Individuals are just responding to the actual availability of the resource, okay? Exploitative competition is a similar idea, except it's sort of not quite as extreme. So it's a less severe form of this scramble competition we just talked about. So each individual is affected by the amount of shared resource that remains in the environment. So again, in this type of competition, it's a response of individuals to the resource that's there. It's not individuals competing with each other. It's individuals responding to the amount of resource that's available. But in the case of exploitative competition, and now not everyone suffers. So we got some sad faces, but also some happy faces. So not everyone suffers, as was the case, right, for scramble competition. Here, again, competing individuals are not necessarily reacting to each other. So what this is about is that some individuals use the resources more efficiently than others. So these happy faces, they're better at getting those resources and using them. These sad faces are not as good at it. So those guys aren't competing directly with each other. It's just some of them are better at getting the resources than others. So again, they're responding to the resources in the environment rather than explicitly competing with each other. They're not fighting each other for those resources, okay? And so basically some individuals use resources more efficiently than others. And those are the happy faces, the ones that use the resources more efficiently, okay? And then the third type, now we introduce the impact of individuals directly competing with each other. So contest or interference competition. So the negative effects of limited resources are confined to just a fraction of the population, and members of the population are now interacting with each other directly, okay? So once the population passes the point at which resources are now becoming limiting, so once you get a high density population and now the resources are a limiting factor, then a fraction of the individuals will still get everything they need, but those ones that then some suffer because they can't get what they need. So there's always going to be some that are getting what they need because they are better, they compete with the others, and they get what they need. So the remaining individuals get less than what they need, and so then they don't produce offspring, or maybe they even die, okay? So only some suffer, okay? And there's this direct interaction between individuals that are fighting for the resource, and so the loser of those fights doesn't get the resource, they suffer, okay? So the unhappy faces, the sad faces are the losers in those fights. So then intraspecific competition is, right, it's going to influence birth rates and death rates, and then it's going to impact individual growth, like somatic growth rates of individuals in this density-dependent type of way. So its effects are going to first impact like the overall welfare of the population, and then as it kind of goes on, the impacts are going to be more accentuated and then start to affect individual fitness as well. Okay, so again, this intraspecific competition, right, it's going to influence birth rates and death rates, and then the the somatic growth of individuals in this density-dependent kind of way, right? When it gets really high densities, then you're going to have reductions in birth rates and death rates, et cetera. An increase in death rates, reduction in birth rates. Okay, so again, the impacts are sort of first happening at the population level, this population regulatory sort of level. And then later on, the impacts can get very narrowed and impact individuals. So individual fitness becomes impacted. Okay, so let's look at kind of how this plays out. So this is looking at the effects on somatic growth, and we're going to talk about impacts on fecundity as well. So when a population reaches a point at which the resources, especially if we're talking about food, that's a really good resource to use as an example. So when a population gets to a point where like the food resources are insufficient to meet the needs of all the individuals, right? Something has to give, right? Not, there has to be something happening. So in populations that are characterized by that scramble competition that we said first, and that exploitative competition, and individuals are responding to the lower level of food. One way they can do that is by reducing their body growth, right? So that's one way they can respond to that. So you have this inverse relationship between population density and individual somatic growth, individual body growth. And we see this among poikilothermic vertebrates. So there's an example here for a frog called Rana tigrina, and it has to do with the growth rate in a density-dependent way of the tadpoles. And it's in the context of how those tadpoles grow under different densities and how fast they reach minimum size needed to metamorphose into little froglets. So we'll look at the graph here. So we've got time in weeks across the y-axis. We have mean body mass along the x-axis. This black line is important. This line demarcates the size needed to get to metamorphosis. So the tadpoles have to get this big, at least this big, before they can change from a tadpole to a froglet. Okay, so this is the minimum size, about 0.75 grams. Okay, and then we have four experimental treatments from a laboratory exercise. So in the one extreme, so here's the high density, 160 tadpoles per tank. I don't remember how large the tanks are, but that's not really relevant. It's just this is the really high density in green. And then the really low density is here in dark blue. This is 5 tadpoles per tank. So if we look at just those extremes, you can see some really big impacts, right? So in the high density situation, you see there's much lower, slower growth rate compared to the low density situation, right? Which makes sense, right? These guys are competing for those resources. So they have a much slower growth rate. And of course, then the implication is it takes them much longer to get to that minimum size for metamorphosis compared to these guys who can grow much faster because of the lower density and much quicker get to that metamorphic stage. And in fact, they go past it and they metamorphose at a bigger size. These guys, they just barely get there, and then so they end up metamorphosing at a small size. Because you can think about how these froglets would be when they're competing with each other. These guys are probably not going to compete as well because they're so much smaller and they took so much longer to get there. These guys are big and they're there sooner, so they're going to be already present in the environment in a natural situation and outcompete these guys, right? Who show up later and smaller. So there's very clear impacts here of density, population density on somatic growth or body growth, right? So interestingly, in these experiments too, a sort of side thing about this is that the intraspecific competition actually had a minimal influence on the overall population size. So the total biomass remained approximately the same, but was partitioned differently under the different density regimes. So basically you could have a lot of little tadpoles or a few large tadpoles. We have that interesting idea of a trade-off, but overall, like the total biomass is about the same. So again, if you think about it in a biomass context, so a whole bunch of little tadpoles or a few large tadpoles, overall about a similar biomass. Again, that idea of like a pie, right? A biomass pie in this case being partitioned differently, this trade-off. And that's sort of an interesting thing too. We talked about those different ecological rules, so that if you remember the Damoth's rule of energetic equivalence, this idea kind of supports that rule, right? Because we have this case of a sort of single biomass with a different partitioning of things within that. So interesting sort of support for that Damoth's rule of energetic equivalence. Okay, so that's effect on somatic growth, very clear results right there. We can also talk about effects on fecundity. So These relationships among population density, somatic growth, and also fecundity, we can extend these to other groups of vertebrate animals as well, not just those poikilothermic vertebrates that we just looked at for the frog last time. So this, an example here that refers to harp seals. So harp seals become sexually mature when they reach about 87% of their adult body size, of their adult body mass. So they still grow a little bit after they hit maturity, but they need to reach about 87% of their final adult body size before they can reproduce. And at low population densities, the young animals get to this mass much faster than in high population densities. So it's the same thing we just saw for the tadpoles getting to metamorphic size. You can think about these harp seals getting to maturity when they're 87% of their adult size, right? That's getting to their metamorphosis. You can kind of think of it in an analogous way like that. So in a similar way to the frogs, if the population density is really low, the young animals get to that 87% of final mass much quicker than when the population density is really high, and it takes the seals longer to get to that minimum body size needed to become reproductive. So also we can look at fertility, and that's what this graph is showing, and again with harp seals. So here the fertility is measured as the number of females giving birth to young, and it shows a density-dependent effect as well. So we have on the x-axis this population 2 years and older from previous year. This is just one way to measure population size. So just think of this as a population size or population density, which is what we're interested in, right? And then on the y-axis, think about this as the percent of females that are reproducing, right? So this is how many females in the population are reproducing. And it's a pretty clear linear negative pattern, right? So when population density is really high, there's a lot fewer females in the population who are reproducing. When population density is low, lots of females are reproducing. Okay, so again, this is the percent of females reproducing against population density. At low densities, lots of females in the population are producing kids. At high densities, few females in the population are producing kids. So very clear pattern there as well. Some birds exhibit a similar pattern, a similar density-dependent relationship in their fecundity. So in the higher the breeding population, for example, of northern bobwhite quail, which is what this example is, relative to the carrying capacity. So here's the breeding population relative to carrying capacity. So again, you can think about this as a measure of population density, right? So the higher this value, right, the lower the rate of births. You can think about this percent summer population gain. You can think about this as a proxy for measuring births, right? So it's how many births are happening or hatchings are happening. Okay, so again, population density versus reproductive output versus fecundity, and it's a pretty clear pattern. It's not linear like it was for the harp seals. It's a bit more of a curved line, but it's the same idea. When population density is really high relative to carrying capacity, that there's fewer births, right? Fewer kids coming into the population. When you are at a low population size, well below that carrying capacity, you have a much higher reproductive output for those females of those bobwhite quail. We can also look at it with some mammals as well, some other animals. So these examples, they're suggesting that vertebrate populations do indeed respond, to increase numbers in this density-dependent way, right? We see this in somatic growth, we see it in reproductive output, and it's through this intraspecific competition. And the timing of the response is going to depend on the nature of that population. And so it's been suggested, it's been hypothesized that among large mammals with a long lifespan and a low reproduction per reproductive bout, that the regulating mechanisms are not going to kick in until carrying capacity. So you can think about that as like a case-selected species, right? These mechanisms are not going to really kick in until the population, it makes sense, till the population starts to get close to that carrying capacity. So in other words, mortality and natality are more or less in balance, right? Births are compensating for deaths initially as the population is growing. But at carrying capacity now, those density-dependent factors kick in. And so it's going to set in, and then there's going to be some regulation there. So here's a couple of examples. So on the left, we have these bison. So here we have a non-linear relationship again, right? It's curved. So this is a density-dependent change in population size of bison. And the way it's expressed is the number of young per female that are produced, okay? So her reproductive output, her fecundity, versus the number of adults. And it's the way it's showing, right? So initially it's a relatively flat line, and that's showing that it's at low densities, right? There's not really any effect, which is what I said. Mortality and natality are more or less in balance at the start until you start to get to carrying capacity. And so you can infer from this curve, once this starts dipping down, that means those intraspecific factors are kicking in, right? That intraspecific competition. And so you can infer that the carrying capacity must be at around 400 or so individuals, because you start to see this decline in fecundity of the females, right? So, everything is sort of running fairly independent of density, because it's a fairly flat line initially. But then you start to see this impact of population density. When the population reaches carrying capacity, then the birth rate declines with increasing density. So again, you can infer from this graph that carrying capacity is at about 400 or so individuals, where you start to see maybe 450 individuals, where you start to see the curve coming down. And in this example over here, this is a linear relationship between calf recruitment and the previous year's population size. So again, population size, density on the x-axis, and female reproductive output here, females who have babies standing with them at the survey. And so as the population size increases, the number of young produced per female decreases. Pretty straightforward, lots of data points around this line, right? So high population density, very few females that have kids. Low population density, lots of females who have kids, who have calves in this elk population. Okay. So we've seen effects then on somatic growth and effects on reproductive output and fecundity. Okay. So then how do individuals respond as their population starts to get dense, starts to increase? Their living space is going to become more crowded. Their food has to be shared among more individuals. More and more hungry members are now in the group. What's going to happen? So one of the responses to this is to become stressed out, right? So one response is to have this increased stress. And stress invertebrates can act on individuals in a physiological feedback sort of system that involves the endocrine system, the hormone system, right? So we have this, so stress kicks in when things start to get really dense and the animals get stressed out, just like we do. We're animals. So you have this physiological feedback that involves the endocrine system, right? Involves the hormone system. And this, the system is mostly, associated with the pituitary, right? The pituitary and the adrenal glands as well are sort of part of some of the main components in this response. Excuse me. So stress then, when an animal is under stress, this triggers hyperactivation of this HPA cortical system axis, right? This hypothalamus, pituitary adrenocortical system. Okay, the HPA axis, I think, is what it's often called. Excuse me, let me take a drink. Okay, so the HPA axis kicks in, which in turn is going to alter the secretion of growth and sex hormones, right? And these, they can be profound hormonal changes that are happening here. And they can suppress growth, they can curtail reproductive functions, they can delay sexual activity or sexual maturity, right? So these hormones are so powerful, they can control so many things. And so in addition, these hormones may change, and they actually may suppress the immune system as well, and cause breakdowns in white blood cells. And this is also going to then increase an individual's vulnerability to disease, right? So stress has all kinds of downstream consequences, affecting growth, affecting maturity, affecting immune response, resulting in greater vulnerability to disease. And stress among pregnant females may increase, for example, chances of spontaneous abortion of the pregnancy, or pregnancy, I guess is the right word, right? It can also, can cause spontaneous abortion, can also cause inadequate lactation. If the female successfully produces that litter, then she may be stressed out enough to have inadequate milk supply. And then so the nurslings are stunted or they may not survive. So all kinds of impacts here. So then stress can result in decreased birth rates and increased mortality, right? So decreased births and increased deaths in the population. So obviously stress is going to be impacting populations. Okay, so pheromones, which are chemicals that are released by animals, and they're used for communication among individuals of the same species. So pheromones that are present in the urine of adult rodents has been shown to inhibit reproduction among members of the population. So this is a pretty cool study. So the study was from wild female house mice living in populations of different densities, in low density populations and high density populations. And the way the study was done, the clover leaf on a highway, right? So you have the highway and then the clover leaf. The study sites were actually within the circles of those clover leaves, the grassy areas. That was the study system that was used. And so there were high density and low density populations of house mice in the clover leaf of the highway. So urine from females in the high density population was collected and then placed on filter paper. And then that filter paper was placed in a cage with juvenile females in the laboratory, right? So they collected urine from these high density adult females in the population and then put it on a filter paper and then exposed that filter paper to juvenile females in the lab. And they found that the urine from the high density females caused the juveniles to delay puberty. It delayed their hitting sexual maturity. In contrast, the same idea, taking urine from females in the low population density, putting it on a filter paper, and then exposing that to juvenile females did not cause a delay in puberty. So it suggests that in this high density situation, right, there's a population regulatory mechanism happening there that's preventing more reproductively mature females from entering the population. This feedback system is happening. So the results suggest that pheromones present in the urine of the high population density females is delaying puberty and then slowing population growth when population density is high, which is a really, really interesting finding. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about dispersal as a mechanism related to population regulation. So, instead of coping with stress, some animals may just run away from their problems and disperse away from the stressful situation. So they'll leave and maybe go seek some vacant habitats and try their luck there. So, in most dispersal is most obvious when a population density is high, right? When the population is really high, individuals will leave to go try to find somewhere better to go. So although dispersal is really most obvious then when population density is high, it is actually a relatively constant phenomenon. Some individuals will disperse away and leave, even if it's not a high density situation. It actually, whether or not the population is crowded, some individuals still leave. So dispersal is happening all the time. Again, it's most obvious when we think about it at a high density population, individuals are going to disperse away. But in fact, dispersal is happening all the way along, even as the population is growing. So whether or not the population is crowded, some individuals may disperse away. Okay, so when there is a lack of resources, because you're in a high density population, that lack of resources forces individuals out, and it's usually, in that case, it's usually subadults that are driven out because of adult aggression. The odds that those dispersers are not going to make it is pretty high. Some might survive and settle into a new site and it'll be okay, but the odds are that if they're leaving because things are crowded and it's adults sending juveniles out, the chance of those juveniles surviving is not the highest in that situation. So that kind of dispersal, that's because of this overpopulation problem, it really has little influence on population regulation, because basically the dispersers are lost no matter what. They could stay and die, right? They're not going to reproduce, they're not going to survive, or they can leave, which means they're effectively dead from the population anyways, right? So dispersal that results from this overpopulation has little influence on population regulation, because they can either stay and not make it or leave, and then they're not there, so they're not regulating the population. Okay, so that kind of dispersal at high densities doesn't do much to regulate population size. More important to population regulation is dispersal that's taking place when the population's not at that carrying capacity. So it happens when the population density is low or when the population is in a growth phase, right? So well before population reaches carrying capacity, at which point, of course, the resources are overexploited. So in this case, individuals that disperse are not random. When you have it in this situation, when they're dispersing as the population grows, the individuals that leave are not random. Some of them may even be genetically predisposed to disperse. So in this case, there can be an influence on population regulation. So let's talk a little bit more about that idea. So then this question of does dispersal play a role in population regulation? So much of what we have learned about dispersal and population interactions comes from studies of voles that have been in fenced enclosures. So one of the sort of classic textbooks in animal ecology is written by an author named Krebs, Krebs, and you may have seen that author's name on other things that you've come across in your readings related to ecology. So some of these experiments that have been done on voles in these fenced enclosures were from the Krebs lab. So the outcomes of these experiments actually showed that dispersal in fluctuating populations was density independent. Okay, so again, these studies of voles in fenced enclosures and dispersal in the populations of voles was actually density independent. It wasn't because it was overcrowded that dispersal was happening. In fact, most of this dispersal took place during the times when the population was growing, when the population was increasing. So most dispersal, again, takes place during this times of population increase, not when the population is already at carrying capacity. So the way they did this, Krebs and his colleagues, they set up these experimental grids. So they had control grids and experimental grids. And the control grids, the population members were able to immigrate from the grids through tubes. So they had these grids, but there were tubes that allowed them to go out and leave those control sites. And then the experimental grids contained no voles, and so immigration could happen into them, but there was nobody already resident there. Okay, so again, we have control grids, and there's voles inside those, and then they have tubes so that the individuals can leave if they want to leave. And then we have experimental grids where there are no voles present, but immigration can happen into those experimental grids. And so they monitored then what happened, how the voles left the control grids and entered the experimental grids. And colonization of those experimental grids was indeed most rapid when the population size was increasing. Okay, so when population size was increasing in that control grid where the individuals were able to leave, that's when most of the dispersal was happening, most of this dispersal into those experimental sites. Okay, so this brings up an idea of two types of dispersal. So there's pre-saturation dispersal and saturation dispersal. So the first one, pre-saturation dispersal, this takes place during that time of population increase, what we just saw in the vole experiment that I just mentioned. Okay, so during the increase phase of a population, so before the population reaches carrying capacity, before there's been a depletion of resources, there's not that overexploitation happening. So the dispersers are in really good condition. They might be male or female, and they could be any age, but they have a good chance of survival and a high probability of successfully settling into a new area. So that dispersal is density independent, right? It's not because of overcrowding, right? And in this case, the dispersers tend to be, they may, as I said, be genetically predisposed to do this. So they're in good condition, they have a good chance of survival and high probability of success in their new area. On the other hand, saturation dispersal, this is when things are sketchy, right? When carrying capacity has been exceeded, there's been an overexploitation of resources. And so individuals, mostly juveniles, as I said, and subadults that are basically kicked out by the adults, most of those individuals have basically two options. They can stay, but that means they can't reproduce and they might even die, or they can leave. So again, this dispersal is a density dependent dispersal. And so it's not going to really, as I said, play a role in population regulation, because if they stay, they don't reproduce anyways, right? And if they leave, well, obviously they're not reproducing and contributing to that population. So they're kind of dead to the population in either way. So they're not contributing to population regulation. Okay, So we can do also this sort of summary of the costs and benefits of dispersal. And so, the action of dispersal carries with it some costs and some benefits. And we can think about those costs and benefits in terms of genetic things, and those are coded here with a G, and somatic, body things coded here with an S. And there's the two, looking at it in the two contrasting categories. So you can stay at home, which is filipatry, or you can disperse and leave. So staying at home, the costs, there might be some inbreeding, right? That's a genetic cost. There might be reduced fitness because of the resource shortage, so that's bad for your body, okay? And reduced indirect fitness because you're competing with your relatives, right? So this could actually, I should probably put a G here. This is probably more of a genetic consequence than an S consequence, but it's kind of both actually. Okay, and then in terms of benefits, if you stay at home, the total opposite. Maybe there's some good inbreeding because you can maintain locally adapted genes to that environment. So, sort of a gradient there. Reduce physical risks and increase survivorship because you know where everything is, right? You're familiar with everything that's there. You are also familiar with the social environment, and then you can maintain kin associations, right? And help each other. So there's benefits to staying at home too. In terms of dispersal, the costs, so maybe those co-adapted genes are going to be disrupted by leaving, right? So you lose that locally adapted genes thing. Hybrid young may not be well adapted. So hybrid in the context of maybe reproducing with individuals at the site where you disperse to. Again, so similarly to that idea of locally adapted genes. So maybe the alleles are going to be less suited to that new environment. And then there's also greater risk in movement because predators and local diseases, and you don't know where things are, right, in that new spot. The benefits, though, is maybe it's better to have some outbreeding and increased genetic diversity. And of course, you're going to avoid overcrowding and competing with your relatives, right? And so there may be then overall improved fecundity, right? So there's these are all obviously, quite related to each other in how you talk about them, but those are some of the sort of general overviews. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about social interactions too. So intraspecific competition can express itself in social behavior, basically as like the degree of tolerance between individuals of the same species, like how well do they tolerate each other. And so social behavior is one mechanism that can limit the number of animals that can live in a particular habitat and have access, to the food that's there, and to engage in reproduction, right? So social behavior is going to play a role in this. So there's, aggressive and submissive interactions that happen in these social contexts. So this agonistic behavior, right? These interactions, these are the basis for this kind of social organization. And that social organization can take two basic forms. So social dominance or territoriality. And these are sort of the difference between the two involves whether or not the individual interactions has to do with utilizing space as well. Okay, so social dominance, it's based on inter-individual distance and dominance relationships among members of a social group that share the same space. Okay, so social dominance means they're sharing space. Territoriality, now it's exclusive occupation of space, right? They defend boundaries to keep others out of that space. So again, social dominance, there's an overlap of space. And in territoriality, there's exclusive use of space. Okay, so again, this idea that social organization is based on this inter-individual distance. So distance from one another, that provokes like aggression towards each other or some kind of avoidance behavior. You can even think about it in terms of that uniform dispersion we talked about, where the golden eagles are defending territories against each other, right? So there's a social component to that kept them separate and not sharing the same space. Okay. And so they in this case, they share the same space for social dominance. Okay. So the eagle example actually does not hold in that case. The eagle example is for the territoriality. Sorry about that. Okay. So territoriality, again, is division and exclusive use of space by a social group or an individual, and they defend that boundary. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the social dominance component. So it's based on this aggressiveness and intolerance among individuals within a species, right? So there's this idea of dominance of one individual over another. And there's sort of two opposing forces at work here. Then there's, at the same time, there's this mutual attraction, but there's also this sort of intolerance, right? So there's this attraction, but also this social intolerance, which is like a negative reaction to the crowding situation, right? So each individual is going to occupy a position in the group based on dominance and submissiveness. So in the simplest form, so I've got this graphic here that I borrowed off the internet. In this sort of simplest form, there's this sort of linear hierarchy, right? Where you have an alpha individual who's dominant over everybody else, right? So the alpha who's dominant over all, the beta who's dominant over everybody except the alpha. And then you move your way on down the linear hierarchy until you get to the lowest ranking individual, which is called the omega. Okay, so the most subordinate individual. And so this type of hierarchy was first described, this hierarchy was first described in domestic chickens, right? And so it was dubbed a pecking order because chickens establish their dominance by pecking at each other. So this has been called a pecking order. And so individuals establish their position in the hierarchy by pecking on others in the social group. Okay, and so there's a few ways we can have these hierarchies play out. So within each pecking order, there's sort of these complexities. So the first one, and this is like the graphic I just showed, this sort of linear way that a pecking order can happen. So a straight line in which one animal is dominant over everybody else, and then there's this second level which is dominant over everybody below them except for the alpha, and so on down to the omega, as I said before. So, right, A is the alpha here, and D would be the omega in this linear sort of hierarchy. Then you can have this sort of triangular situation, right, where you have, in this case, A is dominant over B, and B is dominant over C, but interestingly, C is now dominant over A. So this triangular sort of situation where an individual who's of a lower rank can actually peck an individual who is in a higher rank. So this C individual can peck this A individual. And then you could have an even more complex situation where you have sort of multiple triangles happening here, where the social rank is not absolutely fixed. The double arrows in this example are indicating encounters between individuals. So this is indicating encounters between individual A and individual B in this case. And so the position of an individual in that social hierarchy is going to be influenced by lots of different things, right? So there can be hormone levels and strength of the individual, and the size, like size and strength of the individual, maybe their previous fighting experience or their previous social rank, or maybe they're exhausted from other things, and so fatigue and stuff means that they may change their position, right? And so this is an interesting one because there's lots of, like I said, complexities happening. So in this case, you can see that in every contest between individual A and B, individual A always wins. So the 14 here means that 14 out of 14 contests between these two were won by animal A, and B won nothing, right? So A always dominates over B. But then if you look at interactions here between B and C, B won 11 of those contests, whereas C won 3 of them. So there's some difference. So B is dominant over C, but it's not as absolute, right? And then you can either also get information from this about who would be the sort of most subordinate, who's the omega in this situation. And if you look at all these contests and who won what, you can see that D is actually the omega in this case. D lost every competition with C. D only won 4 of the competitions with B, and D only won 2 of the competitions with A. So in this overall scheme, D is the omega in this. They lost the most encounters with other individuals. Okay. So in mixed sex groups, the males and the females may have separate hierarchies, right? With males dominant over females, or females equal or to or dominant over males. Like you can have lots of combinations in these mixed sex groups. I had gender in my notes, but this is sex I'm talking about. In other species, dominance can be unrelated to the sex of the animals. And once social hierarchies are well established. So I have gender, sorry, on the slide here. This should actually be sex. So I'm talking about sex of individuals in a reproductive context. And once these social hierarchies are well established, it's really difficult for the subordinates or any newcomers to try and move their way up through the ranks, right? The rise in the hierarchy is often related to sexual activity and hormones. So this is particularly true for species that stay in like groups or flocks or herds throughout the year. So individuals that come into breeding condition, like a female going into estrus, who comes into breeding condition early, even if that individual is typically a subordinate in the winter, for example, they rise in the hierarchy, right, and become more elevated in the hierarchy. If it's a male who comes, in the fall, the males come into a rut, and then they, because of aggressiveness, they move up in the hierarchy. So again, there can be changes in this, who's dominant in the hierarchy based on different things that happen throughout the year that may be influenced by hormones or seasons, for example. So, of course, the dominant individuals get the most resources. So we've said food already, but this also can include matings, right, and shelter, refuges in the environment. And for many species, it's the dominant male who ends up getting most of the matings and therefore usually has the highest fitness. And that, of course, is at the expense of the more subordinate males in that group. Dominant individuals, they're going to get first choice of everything, right? They're going to get first choice of that food and shelter and also space. And when resources are scarce, the subordinate individuals, they may be forced to wait, until everybody else is fed and just get the leftovers, or they maybe even will have to face starvation, maybe even disperse away, right? And so under these types of circumstances, the social interactions are not really regulatory because the outcomes, like when we're thinking about this, so that when individuals compete directly with each other, right, that's contest competition that we said at the start. So this type of contest competition, it just means that the dominant individuals are going to continue to get everything they need, right? Only some will suffer. So under these circumstances, these social interactions are not really called regularly because the dominant one always gets food, always gets mates, right? And if resources become scarce, the subordinates aren't going to get that stuff, but typically the subordinates aren't the ones reproducing anyhow, okay? So only some will suffer, as I said. So dominants always eat and reproduce. So when food's limited, again, the dominants still get to eat and reproduce. They still get the resources. So recruitment into the population doesn't really change because it's usually just the dominant individuals who are reproducing, right? Subordinates don't reproduce regardless of the resource level that might be there. So again, under those sorts of circumstances, these social interactions are not really regulatory for the population because, as I said, the dominant ones always get to eat and reproduce, whether or not resources are scarce. I hope that makes sense. Okay. But we can think about social dominance influencing population regulation, right? If it's going to affect reproduction and survival in some kind of a density-dependent way. So, for example, if we think about wolves, wolves live in small packs of 6 to 12 individuals, and the pack is basically an extended kin group, right? It consists of a mated pair and then several non-breeding but related adults, and then one or more juveniles who were born in the previous year, right? So that are there in this group. So the pack has two social hierarchies in it. So there's one that's headed by the alpha female, and then one that's headed by the alpha male. And then the alpha male is the ultimate leader of the pack, right? He is the most dominant. All the other members defer to that alpha male. But below the alpha male is the beta male, and it's usually the alpha's brother. So he has to defend his position against males in the rest of the pack. But mating within the pack is very tightly regulated, right? Just the alpha male and the alpha female are mating. Okay, so the female, she's preventing lower ranking females from mating with the alpha male. And the alpha male is inhibiting any matings with the alpha female, right? So they just mate with each other. And so then each pack just has one reproducing pair, and then one litter of pups is produced, and then the pups are actually reared cooperatively with all the pack members. So everybody contributes to rearing that litter of pups. So the size of the the population, the wolf pack population in a region is going to be governed by the size of those packs, right? Which hold exclusive areas, right? They have territories. And so regulation of the pack, regulation of the population is going to be dependent upon what's happening in those packs. And so, the influence of food and stuff for each wolf. And again, the food supply itself is not going to really impact births and deaths, right? Because the social structure means that those alpha male and female are always going to have the food, right? And they're going to be able to reproduce. They're not affected by that, right? Like we just said in the previous slide. The alpha female, though, like, so the subordinate wolves, they have little, reproductive potential. They're going to be the ones that are most affected by shortages of food. But the alpha female, she'll even expel other females from the pack if density gets high. So if population density goes up, the alpha female might kick other females out of the pack. So then the social pack becomes really important in population regulation in that case, because if individuals are kicked out of the pack, that then makes a change to the pack size. So when pack size increases, those individuals expelled. So now the birth rate relative to the population size decreases because individuals have been kicked out of the pack. So then in that way, you can say that that social dominance is having an influence on population regulation because density is now playing a role such that the alpha female is starting to kick other females out of the pack and they leave. But again, there's still just that alpha and male and female who are reproducing, but now that the size of the pack has been reduced, and so there's this higher birth rate relative to population size there. So when population size is low, mature males and females still might leave the pack and go settle somewhere else and start a new population as well. So there's these effects of social dominance can also influence population regulation if there's this density-dependent component. Okay, so that's the social dominance part. And now we can talk about territoriality. And remember that that's when there's an exclusive use of space. So territory involves some pretty complex group dynamics as well. So again, territoriality is when an individual animal or a social group is going to defend an exclusive area, which is the territory, and it's not shared with anybody else, right? So nobody else is allowed there. So as a result, then you have territorial individuals that occur in more or less regular patterns, right? And so this is that uniform dispersion that we saw in the golden eagles example. And so, keep in mind that territoriality and the social hierarchy, they're sometimes a bit hard to distinguish because they're sort of a gradient of a similar dominance pattern. And depending on the season and the degree of crowding and the distribution of resources, territoriality can sort of grade into a social hierarchy and vice versa. So there's a bit of a grading that can happen there. And the other thing too is that there's different types of territories. And so types of territories can vary according to the animals who are using them at different times for different reasons. So there's a list here of a few types of different territories. So the first one is a general purpose territory, which might be established in the breeding season. And it's pretty common among mammals and birds. We see this. And within it, basically all the activities from feeding to mating and rearing of the young take place. So it's a sort of general purpose, like feeding's happening there, breeding's happening there, rearing of the young is happening there. And again, this type of general purpose territory is observed among songbirds and some mammals as well. And then late in the breeding season, this sort of general purpose territory might break down. So it's kind of a seasonal territory. Okay. A second type that's probably one of the more common ones, common among hawks, for example, is a mating and nesting territory. And feeding actually happens somewhere else. So just mating and nesting are happening in this territory. So that area, the mating and nesting area, is defended at the exclusion of other individuals. Okay. Mating territories oftentimes are exemplified by things called leks that maybe you've learned about in animal behavior. So a lek is an arena, basically, where males display, do a dance or show feathers or whatever, and females basically watch and then choose their mate. So it's a male lekking arena, and choosy females can watch the males perform and then choose the male. So prairie grouse do this and woodcock do this. So that's an interesting part about these mating areas. Okay, and then nesting territory, as the name says, some birds, for example, like colonial birds, defend only a nesting territory, so they just defend that nest site. Some animals, like hummingbirds and squirrels, defend feeding territories. So I don't know if any of you have hung a hummingbird feeder at your house. You may have noticed this, that the hummingbirds will fight over an individual feeder. And so if you have more than one hummingbird who comes to your property, it might be worthwhile to hang up multiple feeders because they defend and exclusively use feeders. And I have observed this of hummingbirds fighting so that the dominant individual is the only one who gets that feeding territory. And then some birds defend a winter roosting territory instead. So they defend a wintering site when wintering sites are in short supply, right? Then you actually have some defense of those resources. So here's an example of mating territories of grasshopper sparrows over time. So we've got 2 years of data. So we've got 1944 and 1945, so 2 years of data. And the red lines are showing the male territories, and the green dots are the song perches where those males identify that they're the owners of those territories. And you can look at, for some individuals, that from 1 year to the next, that there is some site fidelity, staying at the same place from year to year. So look at male number 5, for example. In both years, his territory, his mating territory is in a very similar spot. If you look at male number 1, his territory is in a bit of a similar spot from year to year. And then an interesting thing is the shift of this male, for example, within a single year of his breeding territories here. And then his territory is in a bit of a different place the next year, but still adjacent to where he was the previous year. So interesting differences also from year to year, but also some evidence of fidelity of mating territories from 1 year to the next. Okay, and so how do the animals notify others that they're defending these territories? So once an animal has established a territory, it has to defend it from intruders. And so birds and frogs and insects, they use vocalizations to defend their territories. So they go to a conspicuous spot and they sing to say, this is my spot. And these songs and calls are basically advertising the fact that the area is already occupied, right? And so they're basically a long distance warning that, to any potential trespassers, that they shouldn't waste their energy trying to come here because this site's already owned by somebody else, right? And if the songs fail, if somebody still tries to intrude, and so the intruder still tries to approach, then of course the next line of defense is some kind of threatening display. So singing is the first sort of method to say this territory is occupied. And if the intruder still approaches, then something may escalate into something else. And so typically there's a threatening visual display. And so the pictures of the drawings here of the birds show some of the different threatening displays that are used, like raising a head crest. That one's not drawn there, but fluffing up the body feathers, presenting the body wings and stuff in a certain way to look bigger. So this guy is doing that too, right? Spreading the wings and tail, waving the wings. These are sort of the next line of defense again to say, hey, this is my spot, go away. In mammals, these displays might include things like putting the ears up, right? Like erecting the ears, maybe baring the fangs, right? To show an aggressive stance. And so these are intimidation displays, right? And so if these fail, then the territory owner might have to chase and attack the intruder. There may be a fight that ensues. Okay. Some mammals will defend territories using scent markers. So this is a bit more of a passive way, right? So they'll strategically urinate on different places to mark the outline of their territory. So this tells intruders where that outline is, but it also tells the owner of that territory, reminds them where their outline is. So if you have a male dog that you take for walks, you've probably had this experience of them peeing on everything in the neighborhood to mark their territory in the neighborhood. So wolves and coyotes mark their territories in this way with these well-placed scent posts. and they frequently renew those markings. They pee on them again, right? They use their urine to mark them over and over again. And so these scent marks are notifying, again, intruders that this site is occupied, and also, again, reminds the residents where their own territory is. And so, why are animals going to defend these territories? Well, it increases their fitness, right? If they're protecting their food resources and their, these predator-safe locations, mate attraction, all these things, right? Those are all things that are going to increase their probability of survival and their probability of successful reproduction. So there's fitness reasons to defend these territories. And so you can talk about then in that sort of cost-benefit analysis way that we often do in this class, talk about when is it good to defend a territory and when is it a waste of time and energy, right? So keeping this in mind, that defending a territory is costly business, right? Because especially if optimal resources are limiting. Because if you're defending a territory, it uses up energy. It also takes up time. And then it's going to interfere with other things that you might want to do, like eat or mate or take care of your young, or maybe, courtship and then mate and take care of your young. So the time that you invest in defending your territory takes away from time and energy that you can invest in other things that are important for your survival and reproduction. So then, like all, sort of economic endeavors, we can think about territorial ownership in a cost-benefit way. And so there has to be this balance, right? So here's a graphic that shows how that could play out. So on the x-axis, we have territory size from small to large. And on the y-axis, we have the cost or the benefit. So the green line is the cost of defense, and the blue line is the benefit of territorial defense. And so as we have seen before, where you have the greatest difference between benefits over costs is the optimal place to be, right? So if you extrapolate, so here is the benefit, the difference between benefit and cost of territoriality, of defending that territory. So this Y is then the optimal territory size because we have the maximum difference between benefits over costs, okay? When you get down to these ends at X and Z, in this case, this is where the lines cross. So below this, it's not worth your time and energy to defend a territory that's that small because the actual cost of defending is greater than the benefits you're going to accrue. So small territories are not worth your time. Similarly, and this is easier to reconcile, large territories are super expensive, right, to defend. They're too huge. You're patrolling all over the place. You can't do anything else. So cost is far, far above the benefits when you get to these large territories. So they're not worth defending. So again, the range here from this X to Z, any of these territory sizes are worth defending because the benefits are above the costs. But the best, most optimal one is right here at Y, where there's the maximum difference between the benefit and the cost. And the other piece of it that when you're thinking about territorial defense is that only territories that have some predictable resources should be defended. If there's no predictability about what you're going to get, then don't, again, waste your time and energy defending that space. So only territories that have predictable resources are worth defense, okay? So territories of this range of sizes where the benefits always outweigh the costs and also where the resources are predictable. That's the only time it's worth your time and energy to defend that territory. Okay, so home range. We've talked about this before. You saw this in the lab, but it's related to this discussion, so I want to bring it up again. So animals possess a home range, right? And you know this. This is the area over which the animal travels and lives seasonally or throughout the year to get everything it needs in life, right? Think about, I've mentioned before, the wood turtle study that was done by a graduate student in the lab, and thinking about this seasonality component of it. So wood turtles have an interesting natural history in that they spend winters in a creek or a river, and then they spend the summers up in terrestrial habitat, up in the woods, where they feed on berries and worms and new vegetation growth and stuff. So they have very different home ranges depending on season. So their winter home range is confined to the river, and their summer home range is primarily confined to the floodplain and the forest adjacent to the river. So you can think about that as a sort of seasonal difference in their home ranges, right? And then the annual home range, the entire yearly home range, then would be all the terrestrial and aquatic habitat combined, right? And so thinking about this idea of territoriality and home range. So home ranges are used, but they're not defended. And you learned about this in lab. But there could be a piece of a home range that is a territory that is defended, right? So there might be, it might be the case if the entire home range is defended, well, then that's the territory. But again, it might be that there's this whole home range, but only one piece of it is defended. Maybe the nesting area is defended. So there's a nesting territory within that home range, okay? The home range of one individual might overlap with the home ranges of other individuals or several other individuals of the same species. And so home ranges of pairs, so this example that's here, this is home ranges of pairs of foxes from 1 year to a subsequent year. And you can see that the home ranges are overlapping. And so this means that there's some kind of social hierarchy that must be present, right? There's some kind of interaction that's happening between these pairs. So in the first year, you can see that the pair that has this orange home range has it in the same place. In the subsequent year, you can see there's a bit of a shift in the home range of the pale purple one compared to 1 year to the next. But again, because these home ranges are overlapping, that's telling you that they're not being territorial, right? Because they would be excluding each other from those sites. So instead, there's some kind of social hierarchy present because they're tolerating each other and there's some overlap in space use, okay? Generally speaking, home ranges don't have fixed boundaries, right? You can see here that there's definitely similarity from 1 year to the next, but it's pretty rare that a home range is absolutely fixed with no, they're rarely really rigid in their outline. It might be compact or continuous or broken into discontinuous parts, also because of trails or runways between places. Some areas might be visited more frequently than other areas. And so also, again, thinking back to your lab that you did on home ranges, we talked about different ways home ranges can be calculated as well, right? There's the minimum convex polygon method, which is just connecting the dots of all the locations with no angle greater than 180 degrees, and you just take the area of that polygon. And that is one way to do it, but it tends to overestimate space use because you're just connecting the dots. And so you're including areas where the animal may never have gone versus kernel home ranges that you learned about, which actually accounts for frequency of locations in given areas. So it's a better representation of how the space is used. You learned about that already in lab. I just wanted to emphasize it here in terms of how it relates to territoriality and social hierarchies. Okay. The size of the home range among mammals tends to be related to body size and also feeding strategies. So this is kind of neat. So, larger mammals tend to have larger home ranges than small-bodied mammals, and carnivores tend to have larger home ranges than similarly sized herbivores. So we can see that here on the graph. So body size is here on the x-axis and home range size on the y-axis. So a couple things. The predators are here. So predators tend to have bigger home ranges than herbivores. So the herbivore line is lower than the predator line. And also there's a difference in steepness too. So, and here as body size gets bigger, the predator's home range size gets bigger. It's true for herbivores too, but it's not quite as steep a line. So if you remember back to one of our much earlier lectures, and we talked about the difference in diets between carnivores and herbivores. And we said that carnivore diets are limited by quantity and not quality, right? Because predators are eating things that are already constitutionally quite like themselves. So quality is not an issue, which is the case for herbivores, right? They're eating low quality food. So for these predators that are eating high quality food, their limitation is quantity. So they need to range far and wide to meet that quantity stuff. So that's why you have this pattern of an increase in home range size with predators, right? So it's about getting enough food, which means they need to move far and wide to find it. We also can see some sex differences, that males tend to have larger home ranges than females. And we also can see some age class differences, that adults tend to have larger home ranges than juveniles. So we have these demographic influences on home range sizes as well. And again, we have this relationship to body size, to body mass. Again, the home range of predators increases at a steeper rate with body size than herbivores. And of course, having a home range, similar to territoriality, having a home range means that there's some advantages because the animal's familiar with the area. It knows where to find food and shelter and cover from enemies with a minimum expenditure of energy, but without defending it, right? Because defense is implied in territories. Okay. And finally, a little bit about density-independent influences. So during the 1950s and 60s, not all ecologists accepted this idea that populations are regulated just by density-dependent factors. It's not all about the logistic growth equation. It's not all about that density-dependent piece revolving around carrying capacity. So there, many argued that density-independent factors are also really important. And so these arguments were largely coming out of the fact that there were different, philosophies and experiences and taxonomic expertise in the ecologists making these arguments. So the density independent folks were mostly working with invertebrates. They were working on insect populations. And so they had a different view. And then those that were talking more about, it's always density dependent factors, they were talking about the more bigger vertebrate animals and mammals and things. So, they came from different aspects. But most ecologists now generally agree that both things matter. Both density dependent and independent factors matter for regulating populations. So by themselves, these density independent factors, they don't do a lot to regulate population growth, because remember that regulation, that implies a homeostatic feedback system, right? But with these density independent factors, we don't have that feedback happening, right? Because that feedback relies on responding to density. We just said it's density independent, okay? But they can have so density independent influences can influence things because they can impact birth rates and death rates. So density independent factors may actually affect a population to such a great deal that they might even mask those density dependent factors. So for example, if you think about weather, right? Weather is a stochastic event. It's an unpredictable event. So it's a density independent event, right? It impacts a population completely independent of what density that population is at, right? So weather, highly stochastic, highly unpredictable, a density independent factor. It can drastically affect, for example, the availability of food, right? Well, then, of course, if food is impacted and reduced, well, now density dependent factors are going to kick in because the availability of food becomes a regulating mechanism, right? That in turn is going to cause a density dependent population regulation, okay? So then you have one coupling with the other. Similar to that is if you look at the influence of things like snow accumulation on this deer population. So deer in the northern part of their range are highly sensitive to severe winters. So on the x-axis, we have snow accumulation, like snow depth. And on the y-axis, we have change in annual population size. And you can see that when there's been a lot of snow, that actually it causes a smaller population, right? So there's this significant relationship between snow accumulation and the annual percent in population change. So snow limits the food, which is then going to affect the nutrition that females have to be able to put into their kids, right? So that snow factor, that's density independent, but because of that snow, now there's going to be an impact on resources available, which is then going to kick in density dependent factors. So again, they work in tandem with each other. Okay, so again, snow limits food, that's going to then impact the nutrition available to females, and then that's going to influence the birth rate, right? So we're going to have this domino effect, right? So density independent factors are then going to drive the response in some density dependent factors. Okay. So our last slide is just a sort of summary of that stuff. I saw some chats popping up, so I'll check those just in a second. So first of all, we talked about 3 types of competition, right? Scramble, exploitative, and contest. So scramble competition, this is the case where nobody gets what they need, right? And everyone suffers. It's a very extreme case. And again, individuals are not interacting with each other. They're interacting with the available resources. Exploitative is a less extreme version of scramble. So again, individuals are responding to the resources that are available rather than directly to each other. But in this case now, some suffer and some do well. And the ones that do well are those that are better at exploiting the available resources. And then contest or interference competition now, this is direct interactions among individuals for the resources. And in this case, again, some suffer, some do fine. All right, then we talked about the effects of competition on growth, like so density effects on somatic growth and fecundity, right? Slower growth at higher population densities for the tadpole example, which meant it took longer for them to reach metamorphosis. And then we talked about the number of females, the harp seals, the number of females giving birth decreases as population density increased. Okay. Talked about stress and then that cool pheromone experiment. So stress, right? For some animals, that's one of their responses to increased density and to competition. So and we saw the experiment that in the house mice, urine from females in the high density population prevented juvenile females from hitting maturity, which is really interesting. So that's a way to regulate the population, right? And then we talked about dispersal, presaturation versus saturation. Saturation dispersal is when things are so crowded and individuals leave, right? Resources are overexploited. And so there's little impact on population regulation in that case, right? Because if individuals stay, they're probably not going to reproduce and they might even die. If individuals leave, it's the same. They're still dead as far as the population is concerned. But it's this dispersal that happens before hitting carrier capacity, the dispersal that happens before as the population is growing, that can have an influence on population regulation. And then finally, we talked about social dominance and territoriality. Social dominance is basically the position in the social group, which is based on dominance and submissiveness, right? Pecking orders. And in that case, remember, social dominance space is shared versus territoriality, which is exclusive use of space. So space is defended and nobody else uses it. It's not shared. And so again, these ideas are social dominance and territoriality. They're sort of degrees of a dominance pattern. Okay. And I only have like 1 minute left in the lecture slot, so I will stop sharing and we'll go to the chat. Oh my, 6 chats. Couple, okay. Yeah, so I messed up with the eagle example. So Lucy asked, the eagle example is of territoriality. Yep, Brooke answered. Thank you. Yes, awesome. Okay, and Samantha says, we have 3 feeders at our cottage and 1 hummingbird hangs out and scares off all the others from all 3 feeders. Wow, that is a seriously dominant hummingbird. That's pretty funny. You're sure it's the same one, eh? That's pretty neat. And then Cheyenne says, you recently learned how serious cats are about making territory now that you have 3. Oh, wow. Yeah, 3 cats. That's, are they male cats? Okay. So any questions or anything else from the lecture about anybody would like to ask? It's actually 11:20 right now, but I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if people have questions. Although I might sneeze before that. Anybody? You're free to go if you're good to go. Yeah, have a great day, everybody. A great weekend. Squirrel fights.